All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So today we're going to tackle the war in Ukraine, but through a very specific lens. We've got this piece of commentary, and it's really brimming with anxieties about where things are headed. It's like, a window into one person's very intense reaction to this whole situation.
Yeah. And specifically, they're reacting to the possibility of the U.S. sending long-range missiles to Ukraine.
Right.
And they even mentioned a New York Times article, so something must have triggered, sparked this whole commentary.
Got it. So, like, their main takeaway, what's their big argument?
They're basically saying that sending these missiles is like a huge escalation,
Uh-huh.
like a major turning point. They see it as basically putting us, the U.S., on a direct collision course with Russia.
Whoa, okay.
Okay.
So to really understand why that's such a big deal, we need to like zoom out a bit, right?
Right.
Like what's the context here?
Totally. So the U.S. and its NATO allies, they've been supporting Ukraine for a while now, providing aid and all that. But the types of weapons we send, that's always been a super sensitive issue.
Yeah, makes
It's
sense.
not just about helping Ukraine, it's about the potential consequences of each type of weapon.
So these long-range missiles, they're a game changer then.
They could be. Yeah,
Yeah.
these missiles have a range of 300 kilometers. That means they could actually hit targets inside Russia,
Like across the border.
across the internationally recognized border, yeah.
Okay, so just to clarify, internationally recognized borders means the official boundaries of a country that are accepted by like the global community.
Right. And using military force to cross those borders is a really big deal in terms of international law and, how conflicts escalate. Up to this point, most of the aid to Ukraine has been about helping them defend themselves within their own territory.
But these new missiles could change that.
Exactly.
And that's where our speaker is like really freaking out, right?
Yeah, they're really concerned.
They see this as the Biden administration pushing us towards a full-on war with Russia, a war they believe most Americans don't want any part of.
And they don't hold back.
Yeah.
They actually called the Biden administration, get this, warmongers,
Wow.
accusing them of putting, personal gain over national security.
So this speaker is not a fan of the Biden administration, to say the least.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. They seem really disillusioned and suspicious of their motives.
It sounds like they see the U.S. as acting alone, almost like a rogue nation, like charging ahead without any support.
That's definitely part of their argument. They claim other countries are hesitant to get as involved as the U.S. is, like we're going too far and leaving everyone else behind.
And then there's this whole thing about Russia watching our elections. They believe Russia sees the Democrats as weaker, more vulnerable to manipulation.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, I think. It raises questions about how our domestic politics play out on the world stage, you know?
Mm.
Like, how are other countries viewing our internal struggles? Could it influence their actions?
So, Russia analyzing our political scene, that makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
But do you think it's realistic that they try to, like, actively mess with our elections?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. Intelligence agencies all over the world, they gather information, they analyze trends.
Right.
That's what they do, right?
Yeah.
But proving actual interference, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
That requires solid evidence, and it's often super hard to prove conclusively.
Our speaker seems convinced that Russia is playing the long game, though, waiting for, the right moment to exploit what they see as weaknesses.
Exactly. And they even suggest that Russia believes a Republican administration would be less likely to support Ukraine.
So they're thinking Russia might see a chance to change the whole balance of power, depending on who wins here in the U.S.
That's what they're implying, yeah. And it makes
Yeah.
you wonder, could our internal political divisions actually embolden Russia? Could it make them more likely to escalate the conflict?
It's a chilling thought.
It is. And it speaks to how tangled up domestic politics and foreign policy can be. It's never as simple as it seems, right?
Definitely not.
There are so many factors at play: internal pressures, economic interests, ideologies.
So it's not always just good guys versus bad guys.
Rarely. The
Okay.
world's a messy place.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the speaker. They're worried about these long-range missiles. They think the Biden administration is leading us towards war, and they're convinced Russia is watching and waiting for the U.S. to trip up.
Right.
Plus, they're really concerned that most people aren't taking this threat seriously enough.
That's a major theme throughout their commentary.
Yeah. They see this huge disconnect between how serious the situation is and how much attention it's actually getting.
It's like they're saying, hey, wake up. We're on the brink of something terrible here.
And they even compare it to, all the focus on social issues, like they're saying we're distracted by the wrong things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, their point is, There are bigger things at stake here. And whether you agree with them or not, it's definitely a perspective worth considering.
Okay, so we've got their core argument. Sending long-range missiles is dangerous. The U.S. is acting reckless and alone. Russia is waiting to pounce. And nobody's paying attention.
All right.
But the thing that really gets me is this potential for nuclear escalation.
Yeah.
They keep hinting at it, and honestly, it's terrifying.
It's definitely the big, scary question hanging over all of this. And to understand why this fear is so powerful, we need to, go back in time a bit.
Okay, let's do it.
Back to the Cold War.
Because to understand what the speaker's talking about, we need to understand that history.
Exactly. So picture this, right?
Hmm.
The whole world is on edge during the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they both have enough nukes to, obliterate everything multiple times over.
Yikes. That's intense.
Yeah, it was constant tension. Every move, every decision, it could have set off a chain reaction.
So basically, our speaker is saying we're heading back to that kind of situation with Ukraine.
That's their fear. They see these parallels between the Cold War and what's happening now. This escalation between the U.S. and Russia, it could, spiral out of control.
Okay, let's get back to our speaker's commentary. One thing that really stuck with me was their claim that Russia isn't just watching the war, they're also watching our elections. They think Russia sees the Democrats as weaker, easier to manipulate.
It's an interesting point. It gets to the heart of how domestic politics can impact the global scene.
Right.
It's not unusual for countries to, analyze the political landscape of other nations, especially rivals or potential threats.
So Russia checking out our political scene, that makes sense. But do you think it's realistic that they would actually try to interfere with our elections?
Well, that's where things get tricky. You see, intelligence agencies, they gather info all the time, they analyze trends, it's part of the job. But to prove they're actively interfering, that's way harder.
Yeah.
You need solid evidence, and that's not always easy to come by.
Our speaker seems to think Russia is playing the long game, though, waiting for, a chance to take advantage of any perceived weakness.
They do. And they even go so far as to suggest that Russia believes a Republican administration would be less willing to help Ukraine, less likely to give them the same level of support.
So they're saying Russia might be looking for an opening, waiting to see who's in charge here in the U.S., and then make their move based on that.
That's what they're implying, yeah. And it raises a really unsettling question. Could our political divisions, the stuff we argue about here at home, could that actually be making Russia bolder? Could it be pushing them to escalate the conflict?
Wow.
It's a question worth thinking about. It just shows how messy things can get, how intertwined everything is.
Right. It's not as straightforward as, like you said before, good guys versus bad guys.
Never it.
Okay, so to recap, we've got the speaker. They're worried about the U.S. sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. They think the Biden administration is making things worse. They believe Russia is just waiting to take advantage of our internal divisions.
Right.
And they're worried that nobody here in the U.S. is taking the threat seriously enough.
They're very concerned about that, a lack of awareness.
Yeah, they're saying we're on the verge of a catastrophe and nobody seems to notice or even care.
And they even compare it to, remember, how much attention social issues get. They're saying, we're focused on the wrong things.
It's a pretty powerful statement, even if you don't completely agree with their perspective. It makes you think, what are our priorities as a society? Are we paying attention to the right things?
Definitely. And it makes you wonder, are we downplaying the potential consequences of this war?
Yeah, are we too caught up in our own little bubbles to see what's really happening on a global scale?
It's possible.
Our speaker certainly seems to think so.
Yeah, they do.
And it's not just about the war itself. It's about how we're talking about it, or rather how we're not talking about it. They feel like nobody's listening.
It's like they're shouting into the void, desperate to warn people about what they see coming.
And with something like this, the stakes are so high, right? That must be a really unsettling feeling.
Absolutely. It speaks to a larger anxiety.
Yeah.
Are we, as a society, are we even capable of dealing with this kind of situation?
Okay, so we've got their fear of nuclear war, this idea that Russia is playing a long game, and their frustration that nobody seems to be paying attention. It's a lot to process.
It is.
And it's a reminder that behind all the geopolitics and the strategies, there are real people,
Yeah.
People who are scared, people who are trying to make sense of a world that feels really chaotic and unpredictable right now.
Absolutely.
Before we move on, there's one more piece of our speaker's commentary that I want to touch on.
Okay.
They make this really pointed statement, almost like an accusation, directed at the Democrats. They say, y'all deserve this.
Wow, that's a loaded phrase. It tells you a lot about their political leanings and where they place the blame for the current situation.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to their commentary. Do you think they're suggesting that the Democrats' policies have actually contributed to this escalation with Russia?
That seems to be their argument, yeah. Like
Yeah.
they're saying that the Democrats' actions, or maybe their inaction, have led us to this dangerous point.
And it's important to remember that this kind of rhetoric, this partisan back and forth, it's not uncommon when you're talking about something as complex and emotionally charged as war.
Right.
People tend to view these events through the lens of their own political beliefs.
Exactly. And it just shows how difficult it can be to have a nuanced conversation about these things.
Yeah.
To separate facts from opinions, to find common ground when there are such strong ideological divides.
So we've got the speaker's fears about nuclear war, their belief that Russia is manipulating the U.S., and their frustration with how all of this is playing out in the public sphere.
Right.
But there's one more piece of their commentary we need to unpack.
Okay.
They're really concerned about the lack of public discourse, the lack of serious conversation about what's happening.
They think this lack of awareness is not only dangerous, but it could be playing right into Russia's hands.
All right, let's dive into that and see what we can learn. It's like, the speaker's seeing a car heading straight for a cliff, and everyone's arguing about what music to play.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. And they're saying this lack of awareness, it could actually benefit Russia. Like, remember, they said Russia's watching us, looking for any sign of weakness.
Right.
A nation divided, too busy fighting amongst itself to see the bigger threat, that's a weakness Russia could exploit.
It makes you think, how important is it to show a united front, especially when things are tense internationally?
It's a huge question. Throughout history, when countries face threats from outside, they've often found strength in unity. When everyone's on the same page, it can really boost morale, give people a sense of purpose.
Excellent.
But when a nation is divided, that creates doubt, undermines leadership, and that's when things can get really dangerous.
And our speaker seems to think that's exactly what's happening now. Remember that comparison they made?
Yeah.
They said people are more worried about, they said, crying about losing over reproductive rights than they are about a potential global conflict.
It's a strong statement for sure, and it shows how frustrated they are with what they see as, misplaced priorities. Whether you agree with them or not, it raises a crucial question.
What's that?
Are we, as a society, really grappling with the seriousness of this war?
Yeah, are we too distracted by everything else going on to see how bad things could get?
It's possible. And the speaker's not alone in thinking that.
Yeah.
Throughout history, there have always been people who worried that societies could become so focused on their own internal problems that they miss the bigger picture, the threats that are coming from outside.
So if our speaker is right, then what? What does it mean for the U.S., for our relationship with Russia? What happens with Ukraine?
Those are big questions, and there are no easy answers. But I think this deep dive has given us some important things to think about. First of all, it's crucial to remember that this is just one person's perspective.
Right.
One viewpoint.
Yeah.
It's important to get a variety of perspectives, to be critical of the information we come across, and to be careful not to get stuck in echo chambers where we only hear what we already agree with.
It's easy to get caught up in one way of looking at things. To really understand a situation like this, we need to hear from different sides.
Absolutely. And secondly, I think this deep dive has reminded us that conflict is about real people.
Yeah.
It's not just about politics and military moves. There are real people whose lives are being turned upside down by this war.
Right.
Their fears, their anxieties, their hopes, those matter. Even if we don't agree with their conclusions, we have to acknowledge what they're going through.
I agree. And finally, I think this conversation has forced us to consider the U.S.'s role in the world and the consequences of our actions. These are tough questions, but they're questions we have to face.
Definitely. As the situation in Ukraine keeps developing, we need to stay informed, keep talking about it, and think about the long-term impact of what our leaders are doing.
This has been, well, it's been a fascinating deep dive. A little unsettling, too, if I'm being honest. But it shows that even in a world where we're all connected, there's still big differences in how we see things.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway here.
What's that?
The need to bridge those gaps between us, to talk to each other, to understand that even when we disagree, we're all in this together.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us as we explored this complex issue. We hope you keep thinking about these things, keep asking questions, keep trying to understand the world around you. Until next time, keep diving deep.